Great. Okay, so yeah, this is very dangerous as a professor, right? I could go on and on here, but you've given me the microphone, and I'll try to limit my comments. And I'll just to repeat, I'm going to have some framing questions about Ribicoff's life.
Go on.
Okay, great. Oh yeah, we have to launch that again. Slideshow right there. There we go. I think I'll just click this. Great. Okay, so let's recap these questions. First of all, should we consider Abraham Ribicoff a Jewish politician or a politician who happened to be Jewish? To what extent should we consider Ribicoff a Connecticut Yankee? Was Abraham Ribicoff a machine politician? And then Ribicoff came to statewide power during the age of Eisenhower. So to what extent should we consider Abraham Ribicoff the Democratic Ike? And I'll propose some ways that we could think about that. And then finally, to what extent was Abraham Ribicoff a visionary who specialized in overcoming religious and racial prejudice and breaking glass ceilings? So those are the 5 questions I'll look at today. And let's start with the question of whether Abraham Ribicoff was a Jewish politician or a politician who happened to be Jewish. Yeah. There we go. So Ribicoff was a native New Englander who was born in 1910 in New Britain. Ribicoff was raised by Jewish immigrants from Poland, but race and religion did not define him in his recollection. According to a 1961 interview, Ribicoff recalled, "In New Britain, you weren't a Jew or an Irishman or a Pole. You were either a good guy or a stinker." So reading Ribicoff's recollection of his childhood evoked the cultural pluralism that Jonathan mentioned, and which was popular in the 1920s with Jewish philosopher Horace Kallen, whose ideas encouraged academics to shift metaphors from the melting pot, where immigrants were blended into one unified whole by sacrificing their unique differences, to the salad bowl metaphor, where the differences and the distinctions were appreciated and praised. Ribicoff recalled, "The Irish kids would visit our house at Parham, and I'd walk to church with them, and they would go to confession." So there was definitely a sense that Ribicoff was more than a Jewish politician, that he was extending himself to the other groups and fit into this theory of pluralism. So my second question, was Ribicoff then a Connecticut Yankee? And this may seem a bit odd at first, but Ribicoff himself told Look magazine in 1930 or 1960, "I admire the Yankees' fairness, their sense of giving everyone a chance, their prudence and their thrift, and also, very important, their idea of not being deeply emotional about anything. In political terms, I think this is basically a middle of the road philosophy. And in the long run, I think it brings the most progress." So again, in this day, as we talked about bipartisanship and divisions, this is an interesting quotation. And it reminds me of John Kennedy and the famous detachment and the rationality that was associated with Kennedy, the calm, dispassionate approach that people attributed, at least, to John Kennedy. Still, Ribicoff did not merely defend the land of steady habits, as Connecticut's been called, and Yankee traditions, but he did seek to change Connecticut politics by representing immigrant families. So let's move to my third question. Was Abraham Ribicoff a machine politician? And so we see this timeline of Ribicoff's career here, right? The time in the State House of Representatives, the US House of Representatives, governor. But let's go back to the origins. This quotation here gives one idea of why Ribicoff entered into public life, And this dovetails again well with my research about John Kennedy as the first Catholic president and Al Smith as the first Catholic nominee from a major party to be president. And according to this quotation, Ribicoff decided to enter politics following Al Smith's defeat in 1928 against Herbert Hoover. Smith was the first Catholic nominated by a major political party to run as president, but Smith's own party, the Democrats, had mixed feelings about Smith. In 1924, at the Democratic National Convention in New York City, a proposed resolution to condemn the Ku Klux Klan failed to pass. It failed to receive enough votes to pass. The Democrats found supporters in Northeastern City thanks to waves of immigrants, but the foundation of the Democratic Party was that solid South. So the Democratic Party was divided, and Ribicoff seems motivated by the goal of changing the Democratic Party to reflect the hopes and dreams of immigrant families such as his own. But this path to power went through urban political bosses, right? And this is where the machine politics element comes. These bosses were mostly Irish, and they would pick winners and losers. So Ribicoff needed a powerful political mentor. And as many of you know, that mentor was John Bailey. John Bailey, at the time, wanted to change Hartford's reigning kingmaker and take that role over himself. He thought Ribicoff could help. And so as these quotations here relate, Bailey and Ribicoff were kind of a dynamic duo that set out to overthrow the existing organization. And they did, essentially. They did do that. And this opened the door for Ribicoff, who in the next few years would reveal himself as more than just a proverbial political hack. So he was more than just a machine politician. Ribicoff learned Connecticut politics through these years, as it says here, through his time in the State House, right? Visiting the towns, knowing the 169 towns. And actually, he would have disagreements with this new boss, John Bailey, that would put him out of favor with the party organization. So if we go back to this slide here, you notice there's a bit of a gap, right? 1942 to 1949, Ribicoff's in the political wilderness, actually, because he comes out of favor with the party. And he then potentially could have disappeared on the political stage. But in 1948, the Democrats were having trouble. President Harry Truman faced a weak economy and a strong Republican challenger, New York Governor Thomas Dewey. You may remember, right, the famous Chicago Tribune headline, Dewey defeats Truman. It was that close that they predicted that Dewey had won. The machine needed Ribicoff, who recalled Bailey in entering Ribicoff's office, putting his feet up on Ribicoff's desk and asking him to run for US Congress. Ribicoff interpreted this turnabout as a lesson about the value of image over political connections. Ribicoff recalled that at the end of those 6 years, I was above party politics, untouched by turmoil. So in the year when Give 'em Hell Harry squeaked to victory, Ribicoff defeated a Republican incumbent in the 1st Congressional District, Hartford County, by 25,000 votes. Okay, sure. Just to continue, 2 years later, Ribicoff won then by the next campaign by 38,000 votes. So Ribicoff was outpacing the Democratic Party. So I'd say Ribicoff's success proved his ability to be more than just a machine politician.
Share. Just trying to fix the PowerPoint for you all. Hold on.
There.
Is
It's
that
there.
better? Great.
Yeah, I think it's there now.
Thank you.
Okay, great. That's great. Here's the, if you missed it, here's the chronology we were talking about. Ribicoff spent these years in the wilderness. 1948, tough year for Democrats. The Soviets had tested an atomic bomb. China had become communist, and then Korean War, stalemate. So these years are difficult for Democrats. And as I have kind of hinted earlier, this was the age of Eisenhower. 1952, Eisenhower was elected, and he will really dominate the next 8 years. So Ribicoff struggled against the popular Republican presidential candidate's coattails in 1952. Eisenhower was very popular, right? He had that catchy Disney cartoon, I Like Ike, and people were really upbeat about Eisenhower. So when Ribicoff ran for Senate in 1952, he was facing a Republican named Prescott Bush, a Yale graduate, a World War I veteran, and a Wall Street banker, and Bush defeated Ribicoff in 1952. So here's my question about, was Ribicoff the Connecticut Eisenhower? A political scientist named Fred Greenstein has called Eisenhower a hidden hand politician. On the surface, he was happy, he was very positive, upbeat. He was the politician who avoided controversy. But behind the scenes, he was really the mastermind of each decision, and he really knew everything that was going on. Some people at the time couldn't believe it because in press conferences, he would kind of stumble around, but actually he had command of the situation. I think Ribicoff had this similar ability to master the publicity and also the behind the scenes nature of politics. So for a couple of examples here, Bernard Baruch, the financier and advisor to presidents, allegedly rejected Ribicoff's request for donations for his campaign, but offered Ribicoff some advice. He said, let them see your face and you won't have any trouble. So again, Ribicoff had that image, which I didn't go through his early years, but he had some entrepreneurial years, which we could talk about later. The Providence Journal reporter in 1961 said his image and his genius for projecting it have raised Ribicoff above the crossfire of normal partisan politics and enabled him to overcome many major obstacles or paradoxes in his career. Ribicoff needed this genius to ascend to the governor's mansion in 1954. Every morning, Ribicoff and his wife, Ruth, read and discussed the editorials. You see Ruth here from the Hartford Current, which was a conservative paper at the time. He ran on an agenda to centralize state politics by abolishing county governments, building better highways, and expanding schools and mental institutions. Although New York had a Jewish governor, Herbert Lehman, for 4 terms in the 1930s, Connecticut had never had a Jewish governor. And as shown in these quotations, he confronted the anti-Semitism that was late in this campaign, in particular in a well-known speech called the American Dream speech. He discussed bigotry, but in a positive way. And he declared that no religious barriers existed to public office in the United States. And he squeaked by the Yankee incumbent Republican John Davis Lodge by 3,115 votes. He became a popular governor. And just as Eisenhower remained popular through the 1950s, Ribicoff became popular as well. Both of these politicians understood how to communicate and how to negotiate. As early as 1955, Ribicoff was promoted by the New Britain Herald as a possible president. Now, this was the local newspaper, his local New Britain newspaper, but still, Ribicoff early on captured the public support. Hurricanes brought flooding to Connecticut's lowlands in 1955, and Ribicoff traveled to these regions for a firsthand view. He held 2 press conferences a day. He located state-mandated budget hearings at the site of the institution that was under review. He appointed businessmen to state commissions, and he praised the integrity of compromise. So all of these techniques, again, were great publicity, great for his public image, and he also had the behind-the-scenes know-how. So the Hartford Times in 1957 published a fawning sentiment: the Republicans have their Ike, but Connecticut Democrats have their Abe. And the honest Abe idea in comparisons to Abe Lincoln were being tossed about at this time. Okay, so the parallels with Eisenhower maybe break down here because Eisenhower's designated successor, Richard Nixon, would not follow him in office. And Ribicoff actually would be the first politician outside Massachusetts to promote John Kennedy as the potential Democratic standard bearer for the presidency. Which leads to my fifth and final question. To what extent was Ribicoff a visionary who specialized in overcoming religious, racial prejudices and breaking glass ceilings? So here's Ribicoff and JFK. And in a 1979 interview, Ribicoff claimed that he identified JFK back in 1950. He even located the time. He said, in Worcester in 1950, I announced that JFK would be president in the future. 10 years later, we know this came to pass. And the two men had served in Congress together from 1949 to 1953. Recall that Ribicoff allegedly entered public office disillusioned with Al Smith's failure to win the presidency in 1928. Actually, some historians think that was a blessing for the future of a Catholic president, because of course, in 1929, Herbert Hoover was left holding the presidency when the stock market crashed. But the Smith effect, the fears that anti-Catholicism would doom a Catholic presidential nominee, lingered still in the 1950s. John Bailey and Ribicoff advanced the theory that Kennedy's Catholicism could actually attract Catholics. They even identified 14 cities around the country where the heavily Catholic populations could tip the balance. In New York, for example, which was, believe it or not, one of those battleground states at the time. California, Illinois. There was this belief that the Catholic population in the cities would tip the balance, perhaps parallel to the way that there was hope that African Americans would help Barack Obama over the top in 2008. So in 1956, the Democrats' two-time presidential nominee, Adlai Stevenson, made a sort of an unprecedented decision to throw his vice presidential nominee choice to the convention, to let the delegates choose his vice presidential nominee. Ribicoff took the opportunity and gave the speech nominating John Kennedy. And Ribicoff's speech illustrated, again, the power of Eisenhower and Ribicoff's vision for the Democratic Party. Ribicoff said that the Democrats face an image problem. He said, quote, "We face a popular opponent. We face a man who has a hold on the American people in the power of Eisenhower." In Ribicoff's view, the Democrats had sound principles, but success would require the type of men who can translate those principles into realities, that can breathe life into those principles. Although Kennedy lost the delegate vote in 1956, Stevenson's defeat in that general election led many Democrats to consider that perhaps JFK was the road not taken and the path that might be worth traveling in 1960. Ribicoff and Kennedy continued to defy the alleged handicap as religious minorities, Jewish and Catholic, and the Connecticut governor spoke out for racial minorities as well in these years. Both Kennedy and Ribicoff rode we might say, a blue wave in 1958 when Ribicoff won the largest plurality in Connecticut history for a governor's race, and Kennedy won overwhelming for the Senate in 1958 as well. Ribicoff's strong lobbying for Kennedy to be nominated in 1960 included chastising Irish politicians who claimed to believe a Catholic could not win on a national stage. He said, "It's odd for me to be here speaking to you Catholics about trying to convince you why a Catholic can win." I've also read that the other Catholics maybe didn't want Kennedy to win because they wanted to be the first Catholic president. So maybe that was part of the equation here. And then on the question of civil rights, some pundits believe that Ribicoff opposed the choice of Southerner Lyndon Johnson as Kennedy's vice presidential nominee, but Ribicoff denied this. Well, Kennedy's narrow victory in November positioned Ribicoff for prime political patronage, and I'll allow Art House to talk about Ribicoff's Senate career, but let me conclude by quoting Ribicoff one more time, and then I'll just kind of review those questions I began with. Some believe that Ribicoff wanted the Attorney General's position and the Kennedy administration. The Attorney General position is known by pundits as the waiting room for an appointment to the Supreme Court. And so some thought that that was Ribicoff's true desire. He denied this at the time, and he said, I don't think a Catholic president should have a Jewish attorney general forcing the integration of Negroes on white Protestants. So clearly he had thought this through, and he recognized also practically the limits of his vision, let's say, of racial and religious minorities attaining the highest offices. He realized that it wouldn't happen overnight, let's say. So thank you for your attention. I propose several ways that we could view Abraham Ribicoff's career: a Jewish politician, a Connecticut Yankee, a machine politician, the Democratic Eisenhower, a visionary who believed in the potential for members of a religious and racial minority group to reach the highest levels of the US government. But I'll just conclude with this comment from one reporter. Perhaps he best summarized the man. He characterized Ribicoff of demonstrating a Hebrew sense of self-righteousness and devotion to higher service, merged with a Yankee ethic of self-reliance. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you for your patience with a couple of our technical issues here tonight. Jonathan encouraged me to share this last little piece with you, which is one of Ribicoff's most famous moments, when at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, which of course was known for the violence with which protesters were met and the turmoil at that convention. He set aside his prepared speech to nominate McGovern and instead talked about what he called the Gestapo tactics that the Chicago Police Department was using. So we have just a quick video clip here. It will have sound in a moment.
I look at the confusion in this hall. Watch on television the turmoil and violence is competing with convention for the attention of the American people. There is something else in my heart tonight, and not the speech that I prepared to give. With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. With George McGovern, we wouldn't have the National Guard. How hard it is to accept the truth. It's a great honor to nominate for the presidency of the United States, George McGovern.
So he may not have been right about George McGovern, but but he was right about the criticism he was leveling there. So thank you for that. And Jonathan Harris is now going to introduce our next speaker, who is joining us on Zoom. So I need to stop the share, which I thought I had already done, but. Hold on, Art, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here.
Sure.
Let me quit the PowerPoint. Oh. Thank you.
Art, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Can everyone hear Art? Art, why don't you try it again?
I can hear you, John. Can you hear me?
I can. I just want to make sure that the people in person here can. Why don't you do a little test for us?
Yeah, testing. Art House about ready to speak. Can you hear me?
Not yet, but we'll.
I'm sorry. I tested the sound from the computer, but I'm not sure that that will fix the Zoom problem. The people on Zoom can hear you fine, Art. That's the good news. Yeah. Hold on a sec.
Art was going to be with us, but he tested positive, so hence the hybrid.
Say well.
Can you try speaking again?
Yes, testing. Beth, I'm testing. I hope you can hear me. I can hear you loud and clear. How can you hear me?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, that's on.
Does that work?
It's still not working great, but that's just our system in the room here is not as good. That's as much as I can turn this up here.
Speaker here.
The speaker is coming out of here, I think.
Yeah. All right, try it now. It's, I think. we
Okay,
might-
I'll speak as loud as I can. Does this help?
Where there's a will, there's a way. First of all, Professor Carty, thank you for being here, for your insightful and thoughtful comments. A great introduction to someone that I've known and looked up to for a long time. Art House started his career as an assistant dean and junior professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts, where he went to school. And now ended at the end of his career, he's returned to academia as an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut. But there were many stops on the way. Economist at the World Bank, White House Fellow at the National Security Council, Director of Congressional Relations and Communications for the U.S. intelligence community under President Obama. And here in Connecticut, work at Cigna, Aetna, Webster Bank, and Chairman of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. He cites, though, as one of his favorite jobs, working for Senator Abe Ribicoff from 1976 to 1980, most of the time as Chief of Staff. The press actually noted that they were especially close, traveling together, working on the Senate floor together, and especially working on strategy and on speeches. I can tell you Art is unabashedly a Ribicoff admirer, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of his stories. Art, I have some questions, but you want to start off with a little intro statement?
I'll do a couple minutes and then, yes, you can pepper me all you like. Thank you, Jonathan. And hello, Beth and Lance. And Professor Tom, you did a great job. I learned a lot. It was fun. I had a couple of reactions. One, you mentioned the relationship of with John Bailey. And after he was selected or helped select Ribicoff to be governor, John Bailey went into his office one day and said, well, he said, I'm chairman, you're governor. I handed you a loaded pistol and now you can get rid of me anytime you want. So they had that kind of back and forth joking, but very respectful relationship. You talked about patronage. I love that, Tom. He once told me, I asked him, I said, you've had such a great career. Did you ever make any mistakes? He said, the biggest mistake I ever made in my life was leaving the governorship of Connecticut to be Secretary of HEW under John Kennedy. He said, you should never be elected to an office and give it up. You promised the people you would serve, do it. He said, plus I hated being Secretary of HEW. I used to run things as governor. You go in there and some 29-year-old jerk from the White House thinks he's a big shot because he went to Harvard Law, calls you up and tries to tell you what to do. Well, he of course had the largest cabinet position and so forth, but that was a big one. And just another comment before I offer a few thoughts. You showed that film of Chicago. I once was in Abe Ribicoff's office when we had the pictures of what he saw from that podium. And Mayor Daley was 15 feet away from him. This was not remote up above a crowd. This is right in his face. And he looked down and said, how the truth hurts. And Bailey was screaming back at him epithets, including you Jew bastard, as the sign language people interpret it to be, hurling all kinds of anti-Semitic epithets at him because he thought Ribicoff, of course, had broken a promise to him. So to deliver that speech when people were almost in arm's reach of you, how he ever carried that out, I don't know. Anyway, it's good to be here. I see so many familiar names on the list here. So hello to my friends. Yeah, Abe Ribicoff, he was a remarkable national figure. It was once said from about the 1970s on that you could write Abe, A-B-E, in skywriting for any American city, and the people down there would know to whom it referred. He was an American icon. He was an unusually talented politician and also a statesman. Is very sensitive. People often didn't realize that this guy really had feelings and he understood a nuance and wanted to know the details of it. And then when he went to war, he was tough. He was tough. I mean, he could be a gentleman and all that stuff, but do not mess around with him when you're in a debate with him. I mean, he could lay you flat. He could go from being sensitive to being a very tough debater and arguer very quickly. And Jonathan, I mean, you were a legislator, you know what a tough vote was, and you cast several, and that's what he did. He was one who could cause controversy or upset people by doing what he thought was right. And you know how painful that is. People want you to do one thing and you in your heart think you should do something else. Well, that to me was always the mark of a good legislator, one who could obey the conscience and do what they thought was right, and which was not always what everybody else wanted them to do. Basic fact we're here to talk about tonight. Abe Ribicoff was Jewish and he was proud to be Jewish. He did not run under a Jewish banner any more than people ran as Italians or as Irishmen or anything else. But he never avoided his faith and his identity. He was very proud of it. He liked to say, I am a United States Senator from Connecticut. I happen to be Jewish. And that says it all. It's exactly how he looked at the challenge. He also supported Israel. And during his career, he did all sorts of things. Many of them were private. Many of them never made the history books, and they were low key to support Israel. He also saw that from time to time, there were serious differences between US foreign policy interests and Israel's interests. And he didn't avoid those differences. He always said Israel needs and depends on a strong United States of America. If we're to be your supporter in the world, we have to do what's right and we have to be strong. And it is in Israel's interest to recognize that the United States needs to stay strong. The dilemma presented by Jewish expectations came up from time to time, and what he saw as his political responsibility began. He told me this one time. We traveled a lot, and when you travel, after you've read your briefing papers and you spent the first couple of hours on the flight, then you can turn to whimsy and talk about other things. He said, Arthur, it began back in 1948 when he ran against a congressman named William Miller. And the nomination came his way very much as Professor Tom has described it. And he said that there was what they had in those days called whistle stops. Almost seems nostalgic with the decline of railroads, but some in the audience may remember that he had trains that go through, and they had a train was coming down through Massachusetts and would stop in various places, and they invited him. Harry Truman invited him to come get on the train in Springfield, Massachusetts, then come down and stop in Windsor and Hartford and Meriden and so on and so on. And a group of Jewish leaders came to him and said, look, you cannot do this. We absolutely forbid you from getting on a train with Harry Truman. He has not recognized Israel. We don't like him. And you cannot do this. And we're adamant about this. And we're going to oppose you if you go up there and join him. And he said, look, I want to win. I'm not doing this just for the whimsy of it all. I want to be the United States congressman. And I'm going to go to Springfield. I'm going to get on that train. And I'm going to tell President Truman what you said and tell him that there's strong sentiment in Connecticut for him to recognize Israel. But you can't tell me as a candidate where I go and what I say. I am the Democratic nominee for Congress, and I don't answer to anybody, including you. So bang, right at the start. So I said, what did Truman do? He said, I went up and I got on the train and I had my moment with Truman. I sat next to him and introduced myself. And I told him, I said, back in Connecticut, there's some in the Jewish community are very upset that I'm here with you because they want you to recognize Israel. And Truman said, he put his hand on my knee. Ribicoff said, Truman put his hand right on his knee and he looked him in the eye and he said, look, young man, I am going to recognize Israel. I'm going to do it when it's the right time to do it. And the right time isn't here yet, but it's going to be here soon and I'm going to do it. Well, of course, the outcome was Ribicoff won, and that started a national political career, national prominence, international prominence, as a political leader who, in his own words, happened to be Jewish. A lot to say about him, Jonathan, but there, I've cleared my throat. I hope people can hear me. And go ahead, give me some questions and let's take it from there.
You got it. You got it, Art. Still want to call you Mr. Chairman. We in Connecticut tend to remember Abe Ribicoff as the first Jewish governor of our state, first Jewish governor of New England for that matter, one of the first Jewish national leaders of stature. But how did he relate to the role of being first, of being out there as a leader?
Well, he recognized that he was, but in that American Dream speech that Tom quoted really sets it forth. But one of the main things of his being first was he thought that anybody, he believed this passionately, anybody should be able to be first. Can you hear me, Jonathan? We got a little barking there. Okay. And that came up many times. I saw it in my own career, obviously JFK. And as Tom said, he lectured those Irish politicians. He said, why is it a Jew has to come into your ranks and tell you that an Irish Catholic can be president of the United States? And he was adamant about that. But I saw it 2 other times too. When Jimmy Carter was running for president, there was some talk about, the Southern Baptist thing and revival tents. And it was a little bit too conservative, a little too evangelical for the New England politicians. I mean, we're a little more laid back than that. And there were questions as to what is a Southern Baptist and are we really comfortable with that and so forth. Well, he laid that out. He just said, listen, whatever anyone's faith is, he or she becomes president, excuse me, and takes it from there. And what they think, how they pray, what they think their values are and so forth, we'll find out, but give everyone a chance. I saw it also personally when occasionally every congressman creates a controversy, and every so often Toby Moffett would do something controversial. Of course, Toby Moffett was an Arab. And so you'd hear this, our Arab congressman, and Abe Ribicoff, furious with that. Don't you dare call him your Arab congressman. He is your congressman. He happened to be a Roman Catholic, so that doesn't matter, but he is your congressman, for heaven's sakes, and he's doing a great job. I don't care where he comes from or what his ethnicity is. So that passion about being first was very real in him. I can tell you, Jonathan, if he were there today, he would be in the front lines of going against anybody objecting to a Muslim being elected to office in the United States. He would be very fervent about that and very welcoming of anybody who was.
Good answers. You touched upon this, Professor Carty also touched upon this. Well, I think it deserves maybe a little more explanation and some stories to illustrate it. So how did Senator Ribicoff define the 2 roles of being Jewish and a prominent political leader? As we've heard, they're not always necessarily in sync with each other. I experienced that occasionally myself. How did he sort that out?
Well, he was proud to be Jewish, and he was a famous Jew. I remember one night I was with him, and we were in Syria, and doing some work. Met with national leaders in Syria, trying to get some work going on a Middle East peace agreement. And at night, he, with a couple of other senators, went to meet with the Jewish community in Damascus, which of course is greatly reduced by now. But this was really remarkable to see. These were brave people who were proud to be Jews and proud to be Syrians. And they gathered maybe 40 or 50, it was wintertime. They had space heaters on, had a little food there. But for them, this was perhaps the most famous Jew they'd ever heard of, coming into their homes and meeting with them and talking with them. He knew he had that role, and he had it in communities all over the United States. And he was very proud. Personally, religion was a personal matter. I mean, he was Reformed. He kept his religion, his observations to himself, but he was observant. It meant a lot to him. And he would get letters from people sometimes saying, this has happened. What should we do? And he would write back saying, we as the people of Connecticut should do this, and this is what I'm going to do. He never saw it as his role to speak for the Jewish community. There are others who have that responsibility. There are religious leaders, there are community leaders, but he did not see himself as a leader of the Jewish community. He was never hesitant, however, to say what he thought we should do politically. I remember, maybe there are people who are here tonight who remember this, but I remember particularly hearing, you always like to hear stories about people, Jonathan, but there was a delegation of 10, 12, they were all men at the time, in the mid-70s who went to Washington for an AIPAC meeting. And they went down to Washington to learn how to lobby and do this and that. And they spent a day or two getting briefed and did these things. And then they were to fan out and go see the senators and congressmen from their state. And they came up to meet with Senator Ribicoff. They came into the room and they all had a little card in hand. And they started asking questions like, how can we improve emigration of Jews from Eastern Europe? And he'd give an answer. Is it time to expand settlements on the West Bank? And Ribicoff said, I don't know, what do you think? Well, AIPAC is in favor of that, and it says right here, this is one of the things we ought to be doing. He said, I don't care. I don't care what AIPAC says. What do you think? And they were very sort of ill at ease here, and because there was a conflict. They came to do things with AIPAC, and yet Abe Ribicoff, the first Jewish governor of Connecticut and a hero, said he didn't care less what AIPAC said. And then they got to the U.S. embassy should be moved to Jerusalem. And he said, what number is that on your list? Well, it's number 3. He said, I don't care, but throw your list away. He said, you didn't come. He said, look, are you Jews or not? Yes, we are. Have you ever heard in your family a discussion of this, the saying, when you have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions? And they all laughed and they'd all heard that. And he went on a description of the intellectual heritage of the Jewish community, the respect for debate, the respect for new ideas, the ability to listen, the ability to talk respectfully amongst each other, to come to conclusion, to change one's mind if you were persuaded to do so. And he said, I couldn't care less what AIPAC sent you here to do. I care a whole lot about what you, as a young Jew from Connecticut, came to here to talk about. So tell me what you think you ought to do. Let's take that embassy. Should we move it to Jerusalem or not? This was in the 80s. Or 70s. What are the pros and cons? Should there be a peace agreement in the Middle East? Will the movement of the embassy be a concession to Israel? Is the United States going to have to be tough on Israel on certain points to get a concession, to get a peace agreement? Should we play that card now? Should we do it later? What do you think? And he finally got these guys around to having a debate, having a discussion. And a lot of them were pretty shaken by the experience because he made it clear he was disdainful of giving a group of youngsters a card with 10 points to go make. He wanted to hear what they thought, and he encouraged them to think for themselves. So that sort of got to the heart of what you're talking about. And that happened several times. I mean, I lived through the F-15 controversy, which was very, very famous, and which was a searing experience for him. The Saudi Air Force was worn out. They were 1950 style Lightning planes, and you needed 2 of them to take spare parts to make a 3rd one fly. And they came to the United States and say, we need interceptors to protect the oil fields. They're worried because they were surrounded by Soviet forces. And in that time, the world was very dependent on the flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. And the US Air Force recommended the F-15 out air to ground capability and with limited range. They'd be based up at the oil fields with an 800-mile radius so they could never reach Israel. And we would be there to monitor their use. Well, AIPAC got way out ahead of the senator. And they announced ahead of time that they didn't want this sale to go through. Well, we got invited to go to Saudi Arabia to meet with the Saudis about this. And I said, Senator, let me brief you on this. And I briefed him. I told him about the controversy. And I said, if you decide to go on this trip, they said, there's going to be just a hailstorm. I mean, all hell's going to break loose. It'll be very controversial. And he looked at me and he really got angry with me. He said, Arthur, He said, in 40 years of politics, I've never backed down from a good fight or a controversy. Let's go to Saudi Arabia. And boy, I took a deep. So we went, he met with the Saudi authorities and he agreed they really did need an air force. We did not want them to get it from the French or from the Russians. This was the best possible way to protect the oil flow. So he came back. President Carter called him and said, look, not only do I need your vote on this, I need you to lead the floor fight. And he thought about it. He said, all right, I will. It's the right thing to do. So I became the floor manager. And this was a bitter fight. AIPAC went after him. In Connecticut, it took out ads in newspapers showing airplanes flying over Israel, dropping bombs on Israel. And it said, Abe Ribicoff has turned into a self-hating Jew who has turned his back on Israel. It's time to tell him what you think about that. So we received an avalanche of mail and phone calls. Everybody, why have you turned your back on Israel and all that sort of stuff? And it was a very, very tough time for him. Well, we went to the Senate floor and we won by 9 votes. This was the only time in the history of the United States Senate that AIPAC had ever lost a vote on the floor of the Senate. And I had 5 or 6 other senators who'd come to me and say, look, I'm up for election. This is a tough vote for me. I'd rather not do it. But if you're going to need my vote, tell me and I'll give it to you. So we won by 9 and we had 5 or 6 in the back pocket as well. And when it went through, he immediately started receiving phone calls from old friends or anything. Gee, Abe, I was asked to sign a petition and I was asked to sign and write a letter to you and so forth. And gee, I really didn't mean it. And I hope I didn't hurt your feelings. And it really hurt because a lot of these things were very, very personal. They said about him. And, it all came back together again. Well, the head of AIPAC was gone within 9 months. And I'm told it was because of how we'd mismanaged this. And we started to recuperate. The very next day after that vote, and it was signaled across, it was the evening news, it was the main headline and everything else, was Abe Ribicoff did what was right for the country and so on. Well, I had a call, and it was a senior intelligence officer in the Israeli embassy. He said, Art, he said, you free for lunch? And I took a deep breath and I said, well, I certainly can be. Let's get together because I knew I was going to have this meeting at some point or another. So we met for lunch, and I was really uptight because the Israelis took that quite seriously. We sat at lunch, and he looked back at me and he sort of smiled and he said, well, you beat us. And I said, we didn't beat you. Abe Ribicoff did what he honestly thought was the right thing for the United States. And in doing the right thing for the United States, we're in a stronger position to defend Israel. He said, well, you won. I said, yeah, we won. He said, well, you bastard, you beat us. That's how I look at it. But I propose a toast. And I said, I'm open to toast. So he raised his iced tea and he said, here's to us working together tomorrow and thereafter. And I said, boy, am I ready for that toast. So we clinked our iced tea, drank a toast, and cooperated the next day and thereafter. So relations with Israel recuperated within 24 hours. It took a lot longer for them to heal over with AIPAC. All right, two stories, took too long to tell them, but thanks for the question.
It's a great story. I mean, and that back in the day, just a reflection here of when you could actually have a floor fight, a policy difference with someone, and realize that you didn't have to denigrate them, dehumanize them. And by the way, they could be your next best friend the next day in the next fight. And unfortunately, we don't have it anymore. But I wanted to pick up on that and what I mentioned in my Dvar Torah about pluralism and about acceptance of different ideas, bipartisanship, because the lack of bipartisanship in today's politics is widely recognized and lamented. How did Senator Ribicoff manage relations with the other side of the aisle?
Yeah, and to the point you just made, you know who led the floor fight on the other side of that issue that we just talked about? Jake Javits. 2 guys who were close friends and real rivals their entire career. And it wasn't the first time they'd squared off on the Senate floor, going after each other. I mean, it was a thing of beauty. Yeah,
One has a convention center named after him.
That's right. Well, first he was strongly and adamantly a Democrat. He was at home in the Democratic Party. At times he was at odds with leadership on his issues, but he respected the Republican Party. And he always said that nothing of lasting value happens in this country unless it has bipartisan support. If you just do it with one party, it'll be there, it'll be reversed when the other guys come in. So he was a leader of bipartisanship. He was chairman of the Government Affairs Committee, and the ranking minority member was Chuck Percy of Illinois. And whenever he went to the floor, it was never, the way the other chairs frequently did, it was never his bill. It was always the Ribicoff Percy bill. And he went through and they did it together. And we were heading back one day and I said, Senator, are you pleased with what happened? And he looked at me as though I was of a pretty low IQ. I didn't have a clue what was going on. He said, Arthur, I got 75% of what I wanted. Chuck Percy got 25%. And we won overwhelmingly. I mean, that's how it's supposed to work. I said, yes, sir. No, yes, Senator, you got a point. I got it. His best friend in the United States Senate was Howard Baker. I'm talking Sunday nights getting together with their wives and so on. Mark Hatfield is one of his best friends. But that attitude of seeing the other side, Jonathan, was both bipartisan with Republicans, but it also happened with Democrats. There was one famous case where the Southern Democrats were resisting efforts by the Northern Democrats to desegregate schools de facto. And Herman Talmadge of Georgia stood up on the Senate floor and said, look, you Northerners, your schools in your inner cities are as segregated as they are in the South, and you just won't recognize it. And the shock of some, Abe Ribicoff took the floor and said, Senator Talmadge, you're right. They are. So let's make this legislation affect both Southern schools and the urban schools in Connecticut that de facto are segregated. Kind of shocked the Southerners, and it came together and they passed the legislation. So that respect of the other side, listening and not seeing compromise as a dirty word, if you could get where you're trying to go and maintain your integrity, was very, very important to him.
Great. Lightning round here. There's a story that you had told me about the senator visiting Eastern Europe right near his parents' village. You want to tell that to everybody? Because
Yeah. These were the strategic arms limitation talks. And to be ratified by the Senate created a committee. Senator Ribicoff chaired it, and we went to the Soviet Union to discuss it. We went to several different cities and debated it. There were some senators who were pro the SALT. It's called the SALT II Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Talk. Some were against it, and some were there to get educated. And the Chairman Ribicoff was in favor of the SALT agreement, and he was very proud of the fact that his parents had, been able to come to the United States from what was then Poland. And he told the Soviets at one point, we were in Minsk, which is now of course, in Belarus, that his parents had lived not far from there, about 60 miles, in a very small village in what was then Poland, but became part of Belarus at the end of World War II. And of course, the Soviets grabbed that immediately and saw that as a possible way to please Senator Ribicoff by taking him there. They said, we'll fly you there tomorrow. And he was shocked, stunned. But so the next morning, he and I and Mrs. Ribicoff went to a military base and a helicopter waiting, and we started to get on. I literally got bumped. An elbow in my ribs by one of the Soviet officials who was not going to be left off this flight. So I got bumped off. I didn't get to go, but they flew to the village and came back. And I spoke with the senator right then. And I could tell he was very emotional. He was very moved. And I asked him how it was. And he was there with Mrs. Ribicoff. And he said, first of all, it was a little village and it had a shtetl. And he went through and he said it was right out of Fiddler in the Roof. And he said it was just a beautiful thing. He said, but there was no one in that village who was over 60 years old. They'd either all been killed in the Holocaust or all forced to leave. And he said, I realized that had my parents not emigrated, life would have ended. I would never have been born. And it was just a profound personal living of the horror of that entire episode. And then he smiled and he said, he said, they put a lunch on. The people in the village heard I was coming and they got together and they cooked the food. And he went through all these different dishes that were prepared. And he said, he had tears in his eyes. He said, it was my mother's cooking. I tasted all those dishes that I had grown up eating as a child. So yeah, there's this very human side of him that I saw at that point.
Yeah, I was touched by that, and it's a Jewish audience here, so we have to mention food at least once. Finally, ending on also another kind of a Jewish note. There's a lesson in Judaism that any lesson taught with humor has a lasting value. Are there any stories that you have that you remember as being especially interesting or funny about the senator?
Yeah, I remember one in particular, and I think people in the audience will recognize this. Believe it or not, on certain occasions, the Jewish community gets together, writes letters, signs petitions, makes phone calls, and lets their political leaders know what they think. I'm sure that's never happened to you, Jonathan. But it's a good tradition. It's done throughout the United States. And why not? If you don't get organized, if you don't direct your own destiny, someone else will. Well, there was in the 1970s and thereafter, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which many people will recognize. And the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the International Trade Act of the United States provided that any communist country that wanted to have normal trading relations with the United States had to permit the emigration of dissidents. So Senator Ribicoff was the chairman of the International Trade Subcommittee of Finance. So every year we'd have hearings, and Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Romania and Hungary, and all of them would come, and they was desperate. They needed to have good trade relations with the United States. It was beneficial to them. But they couldn't let everybody go at once, because every year you had to let some go. So, be 100, 200, 300 people per year. And they had to be able to say, oh, this past year we reviewed, and here's 300. And of course, they were a very heavily Jewish population. But you couldn't let them all go because you had to have some next year and the year after. So this was an annual event that went on all the time. And so against that background, Nixon went to China, et cetera. And, Jimmy Carter became president, and Deng Xiaoping visited the United States. Now, this is the first time that a Chinese premier since World War II had ever visited the United States. And among the Jewish community, there was high anxiety that we would create a trade agreement with Deng Xiaoping that would somehow annul Jackson-Vanik. And of course, this was a matter of passionate concern to the Jewish community across the United States, including Canada, of course. So there was a letter writing campaign and phone calls and everything else as to what will Jimmy Carter has to insist that if we have trade relationship with Deng Xiaoping, that the Chinese will allow the emigration of dissidents and not alter or water down the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. So Zbigniew Brzezinski was part of the meetings and so forth. And Senator Ribicoff directed that I be in the office. I think it was on a Saturday. And Brzezinski was going to call me and tell me what happened after the meeting broke up. And I was to call 4 people. And, it was the old, 4 people call 4 people and so on, the word gets out. So I was sitting in my office waiting for the outcome of all this. And the phone rang and it was Brzezinski. And I said, what happened? And he chuckled. He said, well, you're not going to believe it. And I said, well, tell me. He said, President Carter brought up the subject to Premier Deng Xiaoping, saying, if you're going to have normal trade relations with us, you're going to have to allow for the emigration of dissidents. And Deng Xiaoping said, Mr. President, China accepts the American position. And Carter said, completely? No reservations? He said, no, none. We will allow for the emigration of dissidents. Just tell us how many you want. 10 million, 20 million, 40 million. We'll give you as many as you want any year you want them. No one had foreseen that outcome. And so that message went back out to everybody. And of course, it had to be adjusted. It was not the outcome we'd been expecting.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very enlightening and interesting and enjoyable. I'm going to have time for some Q&A from
We can take a couple questions. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule.
Bob Fishman.
Hi, Eric. Thank you, Jonathan. Art, I'm not sure you were, it is.
Bob, you might want to come up just to make sure.
Oh,
Anyone else? A couple people you want to come on up and just so.
I had a couple of things to, wasn't sure you were in the office at the time, but we at the Federation were looking for a way that we didn't have to call every single person in our community for Super Sunday for the general campaign. So I came up with the idea for people who donated $50 or less, could we do a letter that came from Senator Ribicoff, and the envelope would actually say a message from Senator Abe Ribicoff, and it would be a simple letter just saying, would you continue your donation of $50, $25, whatever it was? And he did that. And I don't think that in any other community, they had a senator who would have done that on behalf of the local federation. So again, I thank you if it was during your tenure or your successors. But the other thing I wanted to mention was he was a strong advocate for Soviet Jewry, so much that David Schaefer from your office went with him on one of the trips and visited with one of our Soviet Jews who was a refusenik. Family had already come here, and he was quite helpful. So I really appreciate that. And the last thing I wanted to tell you was this is a sorry part of the Jewish community here in Hartford. When he retired, people did not forget his vote for the AWACS and did not want to give him a tribute when I said, you have to look at the senator's entire career and what he has done for the Jewish community, not what you thought he made a mistake on. And I was voted down. So he never got the tribute that he deserved. I feel bad about that.
It's great to see you. You are a familiar face, a familiar name, and always a constructive intervener. I mean, I loved getting your phone calls. I knew you were always going to try to talk me into something, but you did it in it was such a gentlemanly way. First, the example that you cite goes right to the heart of, I guess, what I describe as that dilemma, that to help Judaism, to help a shul, to help a community, of course he'd love to do that. To advance a cause, he would do that as a United States Senator, so that it was entirely, in his mind, appropriate to reach out a fundraising letter saying it's time to raise money for our community to do this. And he would do that. At the same time, he would not feel at all comfortable advancing a piece of legislation or advocating an issue that was only of interest to the Jewish community. He had to represent all of Connecticut. Secondly, the F-15s and the AWACS, yeah, I know. I mean, that was, I still have scars from that. And believe me, he did, and Mrs. Ribicoff did too. That hurt. To be called a self-hating Jew from people who'd been your lifelong friends. Believe me, I saw the scars on him. That did hurt him. And he tried to be big about it, and he tried to, move forward and so forth. But you're right, there were lasting scars. He passionately believed that that was the right vote. And he noted that those F-15s never came close. They never left the country. They never resulted in all the terrible things that would happen. And they successfully defended the Straits. The other thing, he once met with the Prime Minister he had a letter from the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, who said that this was 4 years after they got the F-15s, that he said, Senator Ribicoff, he said, last week, the F-15s shot down an aircraft coming into our country from another Arab country. And in the wreckage, we found unmixed poisonous gas. It was a nerve agent attack on Saudi Arabia. The two canisters had not joined because they were shot down by the F-15s. And he said, we will always be indebted to you. You saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And we will only use these to defend the purposes for which we agreed, which was the defense of the oil fields. We will never use them against Israel or anyone else. So that was real. David Schaefer, yeah, great memory. Let me show you this. This just came out. It was a book written by Veronica Rosinger. I met her at the Camp David Hotel, and Abe Ribicoff had helped get her parents out of Romania. And 2 weeks ago, she published this book. I made this my personal cause to get Ribicoff got her out. I made it her cause to get her parents out. And Abe Ribicoff went to bat. I fought for that thing for 5 years. Finally, she sent a letter, handwritten letter to President Ceausescu, who was visiting Washington. And that's what this book is all about. And it just brought tears to my eyes. She came and visited me in the United States. But what happened was Ribicoff took that letter, went to lunch with President Ceausescu and said, you want most favored nation agreement? Here is a constituent of yours who needs to be released. And he gave him the letter, and the constituent and the family was released. They both got to Israel, and they both got to spend the last 18 months of their lives with Veronica Rosinger. She's written a book about it. So,
And you
yeah,
wrote-
these stories,
wrote
Brother
forward-
Fishman.
Forward in that book too. So
Yes,
you-
I'm the author of the foreword. I am. But I mean, these stories, the good, the bad, and you can't be an effective leader if you're not afraid, if you're afraid of controversy, as I think Brother Fishman knows. And Abe Ribicoff had guts. I mean, he was not afraid of controversy. And he did what he thought was right. I never know a person who could go to sleep more easily at night, being at home at peace with his own conscience.
Thank you. We have one final question for either Art or Professor Carty.
This is for Mr. House. Another very prominent Jewish politician from Connecticut was, of course, Joe Lieberman. And I wondered if Senator Ribicoff mentored Senator Lieberman in any way, or if they had any relationship.
They were quite far apart in time. I will say this, that he was very pleased that Joe Lieberman becoming the majority leader of the Senate was no big deal. And his rise to be Attorney General and doing those things was not looked upon as pioneering. You don't want pioneers. You want things to be. He loved the fact that Joe Lieberman was an accomplished, skilled politician who also happened to be Jewish. Let's put it that way. The one that he was closer to, because he was Senator Ribicoff's chief of staff for a brief period of time, was Richard Blumenthal. And he was instrumental in having Blumenthal become U.S. attorney for Connecticut. So he was close to him. But I think in general, he looked upon people who came along, pat him on the back. Good for you. Go forth and do what you think is right. And he would not at all mind being called a mentor, perhaps somebody who paved the way. But what he would say to them was, do it your way. Do it your way. Do what you think is right. Answer to your own self. Be proud to be a Jew. Be proud to be an elected official. Take those two and go forth and do what you think you ought to do.
Thank you, Art. And thank you for that question. I want to close this and complete the record. And we have Steve Kleiman here, and he has 2 Abe Ribicoff buttons that I'd like to have on this recording. So one of you. Here we go. Part of this.
I'm proud, very proud to wear these buttons. I remember Abe Ribicoff tenure in office very well. And was proud to wear these pins and hope people voted for him.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. And thank you.
Jonathan, those buttons, he ran for the second term of the Senate. He got his campaign together and he had the slogans and all those put together. Somebody came up with a button, a campaign button, just like that one. And it said, "Stick with the rib." And he took one look at that button. He said, "That is the dumbest, stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life." He said, "What the hell does it take to get what does it take just to get a lousy campaign button?" And his campaign manager said, "Doesn't take much, Abe. You got one right there."
Thank you.
Obviously that one never saw the light of day.
I wish I had one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Professor. Beth, thank you for really organizing and honchoing this, and Mr. President, thank you, and everybody.
And I just want to say a very brief closing comment. First, Art, thank you. Tremendous. Thank you so much for your service. Hope you feel better. It's too bad you couldn't join us, but hopefully at another day. Professor Carney, thank you so much. It was so informative to hear about his background. Jonathan, great thanks for helping to set us this up. It was really a tremendous evening. So good to see everybody here. Two things I want to say. One thing is I grew up in the 70s. And I was thinking and reflecting as we were listening to how Jonathan began, and the idea that I grew up with a Jewish senator from Connecticut. And there was never a moment when I was growing up that I felt left out as a Jew, because our senator was Jewish. It was always Abraham Ribicoff, he's Jewish. And I didn't feel what many of you may have felt, what the senator may have felt growing up years earlier, along with Senator Blumenthal, Senator Lieberman, Joan Kemmler, Nan Glass, and other Jewish politicians. So thank you for Senator Ribicoff to lead the way, so many of us would not feel that same sense of an outsider that other people felt. And then I just want to thank our members of the Historical Society and your support of us, especially over the last 2 years. And we're here, we're going to keep rolling, and we really appreciate all of your support, and we love doing it for you. Thanks so much. Have a nice evening. Oh, there's cookie and seltzers as well. Oh, and thanks, Art. I'm saying goodbye.
Thank you.
I don't want to turn you off, though.
Thank you.
Bye.